Right. Hello, everybody. I hope that you can see us. Uh, this is the session of the Connections Online Game Design Workshop, which is relating to the game Take That Hill, which I originally designed. We have a richness of content for you from four presenters, as I hope you can see, myself, and then Ed, Ian, and Mark, who will introduce themselves as we get to them, but we also aim to leave plenty of time for discussion. Take That Hill, as I say, I designed it myself about 8 years ago, and it's now used quite a lot, actually, within the British Army as a simple manual introductory tool. Let me try and share my slides and start us off. Okay, share screen now. Okay, entire screen, allow. Right, I'm sharing my entire screen, I am told. I hope Chris will tell us if that's not working. I will now move to my slides. Right, you should now see my slide, my introductory slide. Chris, please, I can't see anything of StreamYard now, so if you could shout up if you're not seeing that, I will take silence as assent. Fine. That's me, emeritus professor. I retired just before COVID from being the professor of strategic studies at King's College London. And I specialized increasingly over my long career in conflict simulation and in the application of wargaming to the study of defense issues. I ran for many years, about 15 years or so, an MA option, of which Ed himself is a graduate, actually, teaching people how to design manual conflict simulations, and it's all summarized in my 2012 book that you can see there, Simulating War. Starting off, I'm sure you all have heard of James Dunnigan, and what struck me as we went on with this presentation is how the experience of Take That Hill specifically seems to have reinforced his two key design principles, which you can see there: keep it simple and plagiarize. I will show you how as we go through. I started off wargaming 50 years ago, exactly, in fact, when I was 12 years old, inspired by this book by Charles Grant, with my airfix figures and trying to simulate infantry actions of World War II, which is very much what I'm still doing with games like Take That Hill. Let's just look a little at some of the mechanisms within that. Grant's game essentially had simultaneous turns. Everybody first moved 3 inches, 100 yards, and then everybody simultaneously fired at each other. And you can see there some of the simple D6 die rolls that were used for rifle fire or for machine gun fire, taking account, obviously, of the range and of the cover state of the target. And I thought, this was fine, good, simple way of doing it. Much later, as I became more knowledgeable about the reality behind this stuff and the analytical modeling of this sort of thing, it struck me that this reinforced Lanchester in a bad way. Lanchester, of course, 100 years ago, was a great analyst who's still very influential in the modeling of warfare, and his square law in particular, which lauds the importance of concentration, and which is shown in the graph there, suggests that 1,000 blue riflemen can annihilate 1,000 red riflemen and only suffer less than 300 casualties themselves in doing so, as long as they can fight only half of them at a time. The problem with Lanchester is that if he's right, it's only coincidentally, because his model is so simplistic that taking it at face value is a very, very dangerous thing to do. He leaves out all sorts of stuff which we really should be modeling. The problem with a simple wargame like Grant's is it does actually recreate almost exactly the simplistic assumptions that Lanchester was talking about. The very next year, 1973, there came out something which was much more sophisticated, and this was from Phil Barker and the Wargames Research Group, and it was his World War II rules. You can see there, 1925 to 1950. This had several differences from Grant's approach. One was that it was an I go, you go system. It wasn't simultaneous movement. It was alternate movement, alternate turns. You moved with your infantry or fired. You didn't do both. And that combination created an interesting dynamic, whereas if you moved into view of an enemy, of a defender, they would get the first shot because they're the ones to have the first opportunity after you've moved and created a potential engagement. I've shown there the equivalent tables from these rules compared to grants. The first table at the top isn't that different. You've got a chance of a hit depending on range for different types of weapons and machine guns ranging out further. So far, so similar. But that is not to kill. This is crucial. That is to neutralize or to pin down. If you succeed in hitting, you will stop the enemy that you've targeted moving or firing the next turn. But you will not necessarily destroy them. That's what the second table is about. If you look at the second table, there are two interesting features to it, which I'll just quickly highlight. One of them is that there is a huge difference between what happens at close range with a rifle group and what happens beyond 25 meters. So at close range, it's very easy. You only need to roll 2 or more to convert the neutralization into a kill. Once you close with the enemy, you become very deadly. Beyond 25 meters, though, it depends hugely on the cover state of the target. If you're firing at infantry moving in the open, then 5 or 6 is a 1 in 3 chance. If, on the other hand, you're firing at infantry in slit trench or foxholes, it says 8. Now, of course, it's impossible to roll 8 on a d6. What he means by that is you roll a 6 and then follow it by a 4, 5, or 6. So there's a 1 in 12 chance rather than a 1 in 3 chance. The crucial thing here is that most of the time, your hits at a distance, especially against enemies who are dug in, will only temporarily pin them down. It will not kill them, as in Grant's rules. Now, the more I read about the realities of infantry engagements in this and other periods, the more realistic I found this to be. Here are some extracts from the 1944 Infantry Training Manual, as you can see there on the left. You just read through what is said there about the importance of covering fire, about the way in which when you're under fire, you fire back in order to gradually regain fire superiority, hoping that you're not outnumbered. And that will then enable part of your attacking group, advancing group, to be able to move forward and close with the enemy. The key sentence, I think, is the last one there. Remember, if the enemy's dug in, covering fire seldom kills him. It merely makes him keep his head down so that he's unable to shoot back. So everything I read after the WRG rules convinced me of how important these were as a model of the reality of infantry combat. And this is where Flanagan's second principle of plagiarism comes in, because in effect, the games that I have designed are very much sparking off the inspiration that occurred in me when I first read the Wargames Research Group rules. The one limit I found with these sorts of games was I became increasingly disenchanted with using tape measures and with the necessary ambiguities of games without a formal grid, artificial as that grid might be. Therefore, when I came across board games, and here are two of the most famous and most played examples of those, the Squad Leader series and the Panzer Grenadier series. If you can get over, sadly, the rather Germanophile artwork, which many have remarked upon in this genre, they have this grid, which means that you can precisely define what's going on. There's no ambiguities. However, I found that none of these systems really coincided, as the Wargames Research Group rules have done, with this alternation of fire and movement, the interdependence of the two. There's the precept that there's no point firing unless you're taking advantage of it to move, and it's suicidal to move unless somebody is covering it with fire. I didn't find that these or other games really captured that. Instead, I found that there was too much effectiveness of fire from a distance in killing the enemy in itself, without having to do it as a means to an end. I was an early adopter of the Combat Mission series, and of course Combat Mission in its modern forms is now really the centerpiece of the UK Fight Club, and for good reason. The computer modeling compared to the manual board game or figure modeling that I've done hitherto, of course, allows very sophisticated techniques. The authors of Combat Mission are very proud of their WeGo system, for example, with simultaneous AI-based interpretation of orders compared to the I-Go, You-Go of at least some manual games. And of course, Combat Mission is an extremely flexible system. You can create any scenario you like, any terrain that you like. The problem is that flexibility has its limits. And when it comes down to the game engine itself, of how movement, of how fire is modeled and the effects it has, I found some of the similar problems to those in the board games I just mentioned. And of course, it's more difficult to change that in the computer system unless you really are a computer programmer. So the long and the short of it is, I wasn't able to find anything which recreated for me the excitement I'd felt with those initial radical, to me at least, Wargames Research Group rules, which have now very largely gone out of use compared to all the modern profusion of rules that are now available. So what do you do in that case? You do something yourself. You design it yourself. As Flanagan said, if you can play these manual games, you can design them. My first published effort in this regard was called Fire and Movement. The title emphasizes what the principle of this was. Here's an articulation of it with figures, though it's also just as playable, of course, with counters on a map. I should say about the figures that, as with many miniatures games, they're way over scale. The figures and the houses are vastly bigger than they should be. Each of the hexes represents 150 meters across, and 4 men represent an entire platoon. But what it is, it's a UK battalion attack in random terrain, supported by mortars and machine guns, relatively simple abstract rules, but trying to convey all that I've just said about the importance of fire and movement, having one part of your force firing in order to support the advance and then decisive close engagement of the others against a dug-in this case, German defense of a couple of weakened companies. This sparked some spin-offs. This is one of them, the blockbusting game. I produced this very quickly, actually, when we were due to run Fire and Movement at a Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre study day in Britain. And it became clear there were more people than I had the ability to play Fire and Movement with, so I designed a simple spin-off for urban combat. Very hot topic at the time, and of course since. Called it Blockbusting. The picture I show you is actually Ed Farren's developed version of this, because his graphics look a lot better than mine, being played with one of the groups of my own students. This was a company assault in urban terrain with units representing sections rather than platoons, and the key principle, of course, is being able to suppress the enemy so you don't get cut to pieces as your troops cross the streets, as they need to do in order to get into the offending enemy block. At the same time, I produced a game which has never been published, but which has some utility, I think. And again, I show you Ed's version because it looks a lot better than mine. He used it for a while with some of his army colleagues. And very similar principles to Fire and Movement. In this case, again, it's a company assault with section counters. The difference here is that the enemy is in unknown positions, and in fact, you never know how many or how few there are. It actually is based on the situation on September the 17th, 1944, on the very first day of Operation Market Garden, when on a number of occasions, paratroops had to close with a bridge and try and take it before it was blown up. And the key here is that you never know how many defenders there are, but depending on how many there are, that determines how much time you have to reach the bridge. So you can lose in one of two ways. One is to overestimate the defense and to be too slow and the bridge blows up in your face, or to underestimate the defense, race forward and get cut to pieces by hidden machine guns in the woods. Very interesting balancing mechanism, which I got actually from Caesar's Legions initially, from the Varus scenario, if I remember rightly. But anyway, a variation on a theme. Now, we were asked back in 2014, I think, to do a study day for a brigade command group, about 30 mid-ranking senior officers. And I needed something which was simpler even than any of the games I've just described to you. And it was that encouraged me to devise Take That Hill. Here is the original board version for Take That Hill. I essentially wanted to boil down the key principles of what I've shown you in the other games as far as I possibly could to make something that could be played literally within 5 or at most 10 minutes by people who'd never heard of the game or indeed of wargaming of this form before. I boiled it down to just a single platoon with 3 section counters. I made it like Take That Bridge into a solitaire game with a single enemy counter on a hill that had some very simple AI rules to fire at the attacking sections if it had not been suppressed by those sections. I removed all terrain except for the eponymous hill, and we duly set this up and showed it to the brigade command team. This led to one of the stupidest things I've ever done in my life, which thankfully didn't go as badly wrong as it could have done. Let me just tell you the story. As I say, we were playing this with the brigade command team. The brigade commander was there in front of all of his subordinates, of course, with enormous amounts of face to lose should anything go terribly wrong. Without any prior warning, having explained the very simple rules of Take That Hill, I said to this brigade commander, "Now, why don't you have a go, sir?" Not, of course, even thinking how terrible it would be for him if he were either A, to duck out and to bottle it, or B, to have a go and lose catastrophically, as in the position shown where all his sections are spent in clear view of the fresh defenders. So I could have done this very much better in hindsight. It shows why I'm not necessarily the best person to run a military war game. Very thankfully, he was a very good leader and didn't duck out and get his junior subordinate to play the game. He did it himself without a second's thought. And very luckily for me, he managed to win, I think just by the 1 point. But the key thing is he did manage to win, so everything turned out well in the end. But I really shouldn't take this like that in future. The rules, I've mentioned these, very simple. They're so simple that I can put them on 2 slides. The text isn't as big as I would like, but while you have a quick browse through those, let me just talk through some of the key points. As I said, this is very much based upon the principles espoused in the Wargames Research Group rules. I use the system that I've used in many other games of having the counters either fresh or spent and alternating between these 2 states. So when you move or when you fire, you become spent. Spent units cannot either move or fire, and they have to recover before they can do so again. I avoid any kind of combat results tables by having a simple system based on rolling a dice that's higher than the range in hexes or equal to or higher than the range in hexes. Trying to boil down the rules as well as the size of the game to something as small as and simple as I possibly could. Right, here's the second page of the rules, and you can see the one addition I made. In most of my other games, I have rally being automatic, so that you automatically rally at the end of your turn. In this game, for reasons I'll describe in a second, I decided not to do that. And to have a roll based on your distance from the lead section with the platoon commander. You see there in section 4 the enemy, that's their turn in effect, and simple AI rules as to who they fire on. If there's a choice, if they're spent, of course, if you manage to pin them down, all they do is recover. And again, in the final paragraph there, some very simple victory conditions which measure your performance by combining 2 factors. One is how long it's taken you to take the hill, and the other being how many losses, how many hits you suffered in the process. Okay, let me now run through some of the key points in the design of this game. One, which I've mentioned already, of course, is the IGO-UGO system, now seen as very much passé compared to modern systems such as impulse-based systems, interleaved systems. I'm still a big fan of IGO-UGO for reasons that, if you're interested, you can find in my article, Modeling Time in Wargames, down at the bottom there. Just Google the title, you'll find it easily on PackSims. My interpretation of the IGO-UGO system is that actually the turns are overlaid, as you can see there. It's a leapfrog system. And I actually think this models quite well the observe, orient, decide, act, the OODA loop. So you spend the first half of your player turn watching what the enemy is currently doing to you and updating your plans, which you then execute in the second half while the enemy does the same through their own OODA loop cycle. The other point to note about the sequence of play is, of course, I've chosen to make it move, fire rather than fire, move. Some critics have said, oh, fire, move would be better because you shoot and then you move. My point is, yeah, that's too easy. I want people to decide what they're going to risk moving before they know whether their suppressive fire has actually had its effect. Otherwise, you're far too certain that the enemy really does have his heads down and can't fire back, rather than just waiting for you to pop your assault squad's head up and then they'll blow them off. But that's a key illustration of how significant a very simple change, such as do you have move or fire first, can be in a game such as this. Lines of sight. I bottle this, and I don't include lines of sight on the pretext that the enemy's on a hill, so you can shoot over your friends' heads. Lines of sight are one of the hardest things to model in tactical games, and I think hexagons help, particularly if you've got only up to 5 hexes distance, as in my recent games, because you can actually show all potential intervening hexes that could be an obstacle using a diagram such as the one shown, and never have to start tracing lines on the map. But it's still too complex for a simple game such as this. I bottled it. Ed actually came up with a very interesting, elegant solution in the latest version of the game, which is to say that if there's a friendly section in the same hex row, the same lateral hex row as the one you're in, closer to the target, you can't fire. Very interesting idea. I wish I thought of it myself. Something which wasn't modeled even that well in the WRG rules, but which I think is absolutely crucial and little understood, is the concept of force to space ratios. Everyone talks about 3-to-1 and the importance of having a 3-to-1 ratio of forces to be able to successfully attack. Just as important, in my view, for reasons I discuss at length in my book, is the force to space ratio, the force density. And the reason for that is that if you have too many forces, as the attacker, for example, they get in each other's way. They're just extra targets, or they have to wait behind. They can't effectively be deployed. And so you get a diminishing returns. Both of the, this is a diagram from my book, and both of the situations I show are 3-to-1 ratios between the force strength of the attackers and the defenders. But when both have lots of forces, the ratio of fighting power is far less effective for the attacker in the right-hand example than it is in the left-hand example. So more important than you having lots of forces as the attacker is the defenders being stretched too thin. And my fire and movement game in particular was designed to show how effective a defense can be if it's of optimum defensive dispersion. Now, the way that this is modeled in my games is that you fire on a hex and you target all the enemies in that hex. Doesn't matter if there's 1 or 3, you have equal effect on them all. There is no benefit to them. They're likely to suffer 3 times as many hits if they're crowded together. Not only that, because I don't think that goes far enough, I actually have people firing on 2 adjacent hexes at once, or even 3 in my latest design, so that a single unsuppressed defender can pin down a large number, up to 9 actually, of attacking units, which I think far better reflects the reality than the one-on-one shots which caused the Lanchesterian distortions in Grant. That, by the way, is one of the main things that Lanchester leaves out in his square law, the protective effect of dispersion. I talked to Connections 2018, UK Connections 2018, about how important it is for war games to create dilemmas and trade-offs, as, for example, chess does as a matter of routine. If you can automate something so that it's obvious what to do, there's no point making it a war game. The point of a war game with human players is they don't know what to do. It's all very difficult, and they have to make very difficult resource trade-offs, cost-benefit choices. Allowing units only to move or fire rather than do both, as in grants rules, is a key illustration of this kind of trade-off. In my rules, as I said, I introduced a rally mechanic so that the further you are from the platoon command, the harder it is to rally. That's a downside to dispersion, which otherwise would be a no-brainer, an obvious thing to do as much as the map allows. And therefore, I wanted people to feel these trade-offs, which are very much there in reality, in order that they get some sort of insight into how difficult command actually is, and that there's no necessary right answer, and certainly not one for every single situation. Another key game design problem, of course, is balancing skill and luck. War games are much more ambitious than anything like chess or snakes and ladders or a history book, which are the three extremes of the diagram here from my book, because they've got to do something of all three. It's conceivable that you have a war game based purely on skill, but it wouldn't be very realistic, because in reality, you get good or bad luck. There is no sudden cliff edge from being sure of failure to being certain of success. That we mostly operate in that middle ground, and it's all about managing that risk. And war games really need to show that. Die rolls, of course, in war games, particularly professional war games, often turn people off. But actually, I think they're better than the most common alternative, which is that you have a facilitator who decides what will happen, because that facilitator is likely to choose the most probable outcome. And in fact, the most probable outcome, individual outcome, does not happen all of the time. You do often get black swans, things going horribly wrong. Dice have that happening very simply. If you say, oh, I don't want any kind of chance because this is a professional game, to me, it seems you're actually anti-simulation in terms of the simple modeling of reality. It's very important to playtest, of course. One of the key lessons of any kind of game design is to playtest. Just the other day, I playtested my original version of Take That Hill 10 times, as you can see there. And you can see tabulated the number of turns it took me to take the hill and the number of hits I took in the process and the total that I achieved. Up to 10 is a win, and you'll see I achieved 6 wins. 11 to 15 is a draw. I achieved 3 of those, and 1 was a defeat. It actually would have taken me a lot more than 16 total, but in my rules, you stop at 16 in order to draw a veil over the sad proceedings. I certainly wasn't going to win anytime soon in that particular game. Now, that is mainly, I would suggest, in my case, through the variation is mainly due to variation in die luck, although it does also reflect some tactics. I didn't try any more the tactic that I lost on game 3 or something, and I learned myself very much from that. Differing people with different skills would achieve very different ranges of outcomes, and the whole point of the game is that if you're skillful and lucky, you're likely to win. If you're skillful and unlucky, you're likely to draw. If you're not very skillful and you're lucky, you might draw. If you're not very skillful and you're unlucky, you're almost certain to lose. Okay, that's the kind of balance that one needs to strike, I would suggest. Just quickly finishing from my section. Since Take That Hill was first published by me and then a developed version, as you'll hear, by Ed Farren at Sandhurst, we've tried to reintroduce elements that were cut out from that boiled down version in order to give a bit of added depth to the thing. Ed will talk shortly about the additions he's made, which you can see summarized there, bringing back in things like mortars and machine guns and smoke and wire and so on, many of which were included in my earlier game but cut out for simplicity's sake. I went a rather different route. First of all, I was commissioned soon after Take That Hill to design the so-called Camberley Kriegspiel. Old-fashioned 2-map stuff, battle group operation. You see here a test with my colleagues who were tasked to design this and contracted to design this. A very, very difficult challenge we found. 2 reasons. We tried to use ordinary ordnance survey maps and to find ways of designing rules that would overcome the fact that they're not as clear and modular as special maps like the ones I've shown you already. That was a very difficult challenge. Battle group operations are complex in themselves. The rules became complex. too complex, we found, for most non-gamers in the military to bear. But I think the principal problem was the workload on the umpire. Even an experienced umpire, in my experience, found it enormously difficult manually to coordinate what was going on, and in a reasonable amount of time to flip between the two sides and tell them what was going on. And even if you have a team of umpires, they're not a collective hive mind like the Borg, so they can't just add value as a single super individual will be able to do. So we found this was difficult. The Camberley Kriegspiel was developed. It was further developed by Ivor Gardner, a wonderful enthusiast for wargaming, Colonel Ivor Gardner, within the military. But since he was an advanced squad leader fanatic, the complexity, if anything, increased. And as I say, that became a difficulty. I then returned to systems like the ones I've already shown you. And here's my latest design. It's called Combined Arms. It's basically a battalion attack like fire and movement, but it develops from that with hidden enemies, variable strength enemies, variable terrain as before, bringing back in all the features I took out previously, but also adding in new things like tanks and anti-tank guns and smoke and so on. Good stuff. I played it at the Connections Conference, UK conference in last year. Played it at the local club. And it has enormous depth compared to something simple like Take That Hill, which is only designed to be played a few times before you exhaust the value. But of course, it takes time. It's more complex. It takes time to play, and we didn't actually manage to finish either of the times that I referred to. So you have this perennial trade-off in design. My final slide. The experience of von Reiswitz with Kriegspiel back in the early 19th century is something that I think our experience with Take That Hill again reinforces. What happened with Kriegspiel, of course, is it didn't become popular in the Prussian army until von Reiswitz's son, who was himself an officer, unlike the civilian von Reiswitz, took it on and was able to use it properly with the military, to be one of the military themselves, and to be much more sensitive than, as I've already shown you, I am, with regard to military sensitivities. So I'm very pleased that we have our own von Reiswitz, Junior von Reiswitz now, coming along to talk to us. And that's my former student, Ed Farren. So without further ado, I will pass the baton over to him.
Cool, thanks, Phil. Can I just get a comms check that I'm coming through loud and clear from my deployed location?
Fine to me.
Great, thanks. Okay, everyone, so just while I put my slides up, I definitely caught the end of Phil's presentation. Just to put you in perspective, there was a significant gap in time between where Phil's game ends and the one I'm about to present begins. So there was by no means a sort of instant reaction to the level that Phil's game got to by UK Fight Club. So for those who haven't met UK Fight Club before, we're a wargaming experimentation group. We're founded in the British Army, but tri-service and indeed extra-governmental, a broad church with many franchises in our European Western partners, and always looking for more people who are interested in wargaming for professional benefits. So just to start us off, I'm going to situate the problem we found ourselves in about a year into our being as a club. We'd recently established, and COVID and the pandemic had really helped us get membership through an online medium, because that's where everyone was. However, we were struggling to appeal to a mainstream audience. We tended to find people who were already interested in wargaming, were happy to join, but people who weren't remained on the outside. We had a strong digital wargaming wing with combat mission, flashpoint, and command. And that was going really strong, and naturally so, because we were putting it out on the internet. So that was the way people were consuming the medium. Analog gaming, not so much. However, that digital gaming was difficult to scale given the cost and barrier to entry. You needed to spend a lot of time learning how to play the game, which turned off a lot of people who didn't have either the time or the patience to go through that barrier. Also, these games tended to lend themselves towards an analytical or experimental focus, which, whilst very interesting for certain strata of the membership, wasn't that interesting for others. So myself included, the training and education is where I see most of the value in wargaming, or the bit that I want to get involved in. And sort of looking at the number of hit ratios between a T90 and a Challenger 2 wasn't really exciting me, as important as that is for defense. And then the manual war game that the army did have, the Camry Kriegspiel, which Phil's already mentioned, was largely moribund and not in a physical form. You had to go onto a SharePoint to download it, print it yourself, cut it out yourself, and then run it yourself. The other one in the sort of academic world, DSTL Strike, that had been produced in a physical format, but very few people knew about it, and it was not widely produced or distributed, largely because it had been used in the experimentation envelope. And something Phil's probably already mentioned, that commercial off-the-shelf games, too numerous and too complex to really lock onto. And the vast majority of the Army, Navy, and the Air Force does not, and to a large extent still does not, partake in war games. So our sort of problem statement was how to engage more people in wargaming without a significant cost. So what we were after with Take That Hill, or the version that we wanted to produce. So firstly, it had to be an attractive physical product. It couldn't be something that's online, downloadable. You had to get your hands on it, and it had to look good. Okay, and this is where most of the energy and effort went into it. It had to be a simple game with a commonly understood theme, and Phil's described how he made the game deliberately simple, and I applaud him for those efforts, because it meant I'd had to do very little. And the theme of a dismounted light roll infantry platoon attack is understood by everybody in the army, because that's the thing we get trained to do first of all, which is great. Yes, we could have added armor. Yes, we could have had cyber. We could have had air and artillery, but then you start to lose people. Whereas everyone understands 3 groups of people running at an objective, firing. We need something that was fast paced and that could be played alone or in pairs, or indeed beyond pairs. And this game certainly achieves that. It doesn't muck about. You don't have to spend hours reading the rules, and you have a solitaire mechanism, which is really useful, because a lot of people are going to start wargaming by doing it on their own before they identify that other people also are interested and they can do it in larger groups. We also wanted something that was replayable, and this is probably where we're starting to diverge from the original, with optional complexity and realism. Okay, once you'd understood how the gaming mechanism worked. And from a military user perspective, we wanted it as a vehicle for teaching basic wargame mechanics, so that you learn mechanics of wargaming by playing the game in a subtle manner, so you don't really realize you're doing it. And we wanted it to be a teaching aid for military tactics, not down to replace live training, or instead of reading the doctrine, but as a method by which that could be better explained to an audience of students. And absolutely, we cannot afford to have umpire or facilitation requirement. The reason I say that is because too often I've seen it where it requires an expert, a wizard, to come in and run the war game, and they are available only briefly, intermittently. People then assume that is the only person who can run the war game, when anybody can run a war game with enough preparation and understanding. So that
Ed, can I just butt in? Just that your slides are not advancing. I think we're still on the second of your slides, but you're still showing your front cover slide.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Let me try this again.
I suggest sharing your entire screen, which is what I did, and then what you see is what we see.
Roger, I'll do that. Entire screen. Okay, Bill, right. Can you just confirm that's all up?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So pretty much just as I was saying in the verbal over the top, that's everything we were after with Take That Hill, and the end state being a player who knows a handful of basic wargame mechanics, the hexes, the turn impulses, the I go, you go, all that stuff that Phil's mentioned, and is comfortable playing this intro level game, and is therefore also looking for more exposure to similar or more complex wargames. So this is the gateway by which you enter into a wider world of wargaming. This isn't the be all and end all. I'm very conscious that some people have said, is this it? And you're like, no, this is not it. This is the start of it. And now go forth and find what it is that interests you, whatever that might be. So in terms of transformation, at the top you have the game as designed by Phil, and at the bottom is the sort of final product as delivered by UKFC. fundamentally, they are the same. You can see the exact same number of hexes, except that in Phil's game, you move on from out of the edge of the map, and in the bottom game, I start you in the map, because again, that was a concept I found was difficult for beginner wargamers to sort of be off the edge of the world and moving on to it. So I put them in, and I put them in some good terrain, woods, which we always love to form up in, just to make that more reassuring and comfortable for the military user. But all the hexes are there, the enemies on the hill, fundamentally the same. I put some boundaries on the side to sort of mentally contain the mindset that there is a wider battle space left and right, which comes in the advanced rules. But fundamentally, it is exactly the same. So we have not skewed wildly away from Phil's initial design. The second thing you'll notice is it's colorized, and the
Right. From what I can see, we've just lost Ed. This happened to me in the practice. He's in Kosovo, which is not an ideal situation for this. I hope he knows that he's. Oh no, he won't know. Right, because he's looking at his entire screen. Just to explain for everybody, Chris, please. Hopefully, he has given you some sort of alternative contact information, as I did. Can you call him, please, and tell him that he's carrying on speaking to himself. Meanwhile, while he comes back in, can we just hear a bit from Mark and Ian extempore as to their roles in this and the testing and so on?
Yes, I mean, sort of, it was very interesting from your presentation, Phil, that you introduced a lot of old friends to me. Now, I come in from a different route from both yourself and Ed, that I don't have a professional reason to be a wargamer. I see it from a hobbyist perspective. I like to learn about history. I like to play war games. So I'm a participant first. But what I find, my day job is a solution architect for the National Health Service with computer systems. I find that the wargaming reinforces or certainly assists, hasn't hurt, skill sets that I use on a day-to-day basis. Now, I've introduced also Ian as a fellow hobbyist-style wargamer. His background is different from myself, from chemical engineering, although from a physicist at birth. He is a analytical experimental designer, and he has a different set of skill sets that we blend together in our analysis of gameplay. Now, going back, Phil created Simulating War in 2012. In 2013, the first UK connections started. I tracked both of those. Phil, you'd also written Lost Battles, which was a recommended book, so I knew who you were, and through the the Yahoo groups, we made contact, and we eventually made contact in Connections UK 2016, because I was fascinated with Fire Move. Later down the progression of the family of games you were talking about, so I made an analog game, miniatures, but with a computer-assisted gameplay associated with it. And I came along to Connections UK 2016, met many of the people that you talked about. Ivor Gardner was passionate about the army owning the wargaming element to this, not kind of intellectual property, the heart and soul of it. And you all convinced me there was very much rigor involved in wargaming, far beyond the commercial hobbyist sense. And you also introduced me to wargames developments, and since then I've been a regular attendee at both Conference of Wargamers and returning to Connections UK to rehost Fire Move. Now, COVID's already been mentioned, and I introduced Ian to the wargaming the connections and the wargame development community. And during COVID, we had time to spare, and we started experimenting. Although that take that hill is very much the tic-tac-toe of war games, a very simple game. We try to experiment with design experiments to actually sort of get underneath the bonnet and the hood of the model behind it. It's interesting that we didn't have the full story as what you showed us, Phil, there with the WRG element and the sort of the Charles Grant element, but we played the game extensively, and we wrote a research paper on the findings that we made with respect to our conclusions, that could you use something that was effectively a physical experimentation technique to analyze war games. And we found the results interesting and stimulating. We've got Ed back now.
Okay, Ed's back. Right, Ed. What happened to you is what I was afraid would happen to me, in that while screen sharing, you don't know that you're talking to your screen and nobody else. You dropped out. Now, you dropped out, I think, at that sort of point, actually, yes. So if you pick it up, pick it up from that next slide that you just showed, the one after the 1,000 copies, that one. Yeah.
Just confirm you're still hearing me all right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Right. Sorry, apologies for that.
Yeah.
I am in an austere.
The problem is if you lose StreamYard, you won't hear me telling you.
Yeah.
Okay, carry on.
Yeah, understood. So yeah, apologies. I am in an austere environment and with helicopters and electricity power outages and all the rest of it. So yeah, apologies. So the first step, the attractive physical product, and this is what it looks like if you haven't seen it in the flesh. This is a picture of the product, and general feedback is that it does look the part. It looks professionally produced, like someone cared enough to design it with a sort of a passion, and it draws the eye. You want to pick it up. The colors are bright and infused. Probably not great in terms of printing ink and all the rest of it. It feels personal. It's small, A5-ish. You can fit it in a bag, which is important. You don't have to walk out holding it in your two hands. The pieces punch out. You flip them over. It's kinesthetic all over, which as an infantryman I absolutely love. When someone has it and someone doesn't have it, they say, "Ooh, what's that?" And that then starts a conversation about, "Oh, this is a war game, or what's a war game, or who a fight club," and all that stuff. So the effect of the game is much broader than just teaching someone the mechanics. So we've given it out to a lot of people, both non-war gamers and war gamers, and it's, I think the ripples of the influence have gone a lot further than just people who've physically played it. I do hope that it is being played and not just stuck on someone's game collection shelf, because it isn't. If you already know how to war game and you're not showing someone else this, then you're kind of abusing the tool that we've given you, and it's very useful for Fight Club branding and gifting. So it's live now in like NATO conference in Paris. It's really easy to give out and say, look us up, join us. Here's something, rather than just a business card, which is what everyone else is giving out at these things. So that was good. More importantly, a teaching vehicle. So in a part of the rules has a segment called Instructor's Corner, and that's where a military instructor would go to understand how to apply the game to teach military tactics. And it sort of goes through the whole stage of like, it's not real. Yes, it doesn't do everything. This is how you should use it. And effectively, it prescribes a series of runs, not dissimilar to what Mark and Ian can talk about when they did their experiment. Essentially, you start with the base rules and then you move forward to column 3, because generally the experience from the base rules, if you haven't played this war game and don't understand the mechanics, is you lose, and you lose quite badly. When you start in column 3, you're much more likely to win, because you're in a really good starting point for range to affect suppression on the enemy. And most of our doctrine says that you should be no more than 300 meters away when conducting a light roll attack. So actually the game models that really well. It just provides a challenge in the first 200 meters. And you can almost see it as there's two games. Game 1 is to get to 300 meters, and then game 3 is just do the battle drill, which is to assault the hill using fire movement, as you would do. And then runs 4, 5, and 6 start adding in fire support measures, each with a different mechanic, dice rolling, more dice, fewer dice, and then there's limitations with that which restrict when you can use it. And then the low light rules come in right at the end, which provides that risk opportunities of night fighting, which essentially just dampens the ability to see and the ability to and therefore fire and the ability to rally. And the idea is that there's a sort of talk through with the students and done in a seminar sort of session, and you explain, what do we mean by hex? What do we mean by counters? What is a turn? What is a character? What is, and importantly, focusing on those dice, because so many military people take away the dice because there's allergic reaction. This forces you to engage with the dice, understand that it's not random chance. There are modifiers. The closer you get, the more likely you are to hit. It's not just, oh dear, I didn't get the dice today. And the victory conditions and how they drive actions. In the same way we have a mission statement. And after every run, there's a series of questions which we ask the students to go through. The heart of the system is this relationship diagram, and it kind of says what it does what it says in the tin, where it's about fire and movement and concentration and dispersion. And Phil's comment about dilemmas and trade-offs, that this is a dilemma trade-off system. You can choose to move, which means you have less ability to fire, but moving closer increases your likelihood of hitting. The further you disperse, the less likely you are to receive red fire, which means you're more likely to be available next turn to fire, but you may not rally as well, which means you've got less ability to move and fire. And you can almost go around this to the point of insanity. There is no perfect answer. It is very much conditions based on where you are at a point in each turn and your risk tolerance. Doctrine would state you fire with one and move with one and leave one alone, and that doesn't really work in this system. So you need to change it up, and I like that, because then suddenly we're forcing them to think rather than just doing a battle drill on a game. And you can see all the things there in the bullet points are contained within the heart of the system. That there are feedback loops, there are direct links, there are unintended consequences, but finding that golden thread to success proves hard. And I think when you play the game, sometimes it all comes together, and by turn 5 you're going to win, and other times it just doesn't fall together at all, and it's in pieces, and you're struggling to just hold the line, and running out of time and taking too many hits. The advanced rules. So we put these in for a number of reasons, but I'll just go through what they are essentially. So you have blue fire support. Why do we need blue fire support? So it's another way to suppress red without using the counters that are in play. Doesn't replace the counters, because you can't rely on blue fire support in its entirety, and it just models some of the weapon systems that you might expect in support of a platoon attack with some of the constraints. So for example, machine guns can fire up to a certain number of hexes away, and mortars is more restrictive, okay, but is more effective once they get dialed in, but there's a limited amount of fire. So again, it's the trade-off. If you give all 3 of them to a player, then it's too easy. So the idea would be to sort of pick one, or randomly select and have a play with all of that. The low light affects both sides, but there is an element of bringing illumination in, which can be planned by blue and then reactive by red. So when red tries to shoot at blue and misses, that's when it calls for illumination and it arrives the next turn. And then you have to decide what you're going to do when there is light. Do you fire or and then wait for it to go down, or do you use that time to move because your fire is going to be more effective? Red defenses, again, red has to be limited to what it can do because it's a solitaire system as in the base game. So these are largely static things. The minefield, which is not meant to be a sort of fully fledged minefield, but a sort of nuisance minefield or dummy minefield. The barbed wire, which prevents you assaulting from up to two of the 3 hexes next to the hill, and then the depth positions, which is an often forgotten concept, whereby if you're going right or left flanking, they've thought that out, so they've got somebody covering their right or left flank who's going to interfere with your action. Maybe not to the point where your assault fails, but you'll have to do something about that. And then lastly, adding some mortars for red, which use one of Phil's other systems for calling in fire based on the game turn. And then the advanced morale, which difficult to show on this, but the 2 hit markers in the bottom left indicate direct fire or indirect fire hits, and this is using the psychology study done by Leo Murray in the book Wargame, shown there. And the idea being that the amount of fire you receive should directly relate to the willingness of you to carry on. So being hit once at the moment is the same as being hit 3 times. and we think that should be modelled. And if you're hit by direct fire and indirect fire, then that's doubly so. So we're trying to model when you mix the colours together, the yellow and the orange, it's twice as debilitating. And we also gave the section commanders the ability to rally themselves a bit more independently, because the feedback was that that wasn't realistic for them to be a certain distance from the platoon commander and not able to act, which just sort of shows how maybe modern communications have empowered NCOs in a way that when World War II wargame modelling was going on, that wasn't the case. It was very much line of sight. So show where these advanced rules sit on the model. The fire support goes, funny old thing, at the fire point, and also allowing you to do blue move, because you can move in the game with someone else providing fire support. The low light affects the rallying on both sides, and the rallying is not shown here for red because this is the basic modelling, but red then also is struggling to rally, and the ability to fire down there. Red defences improve red fire if it's the mortars, limit blue movement if it's the minefields or the wire, and it forces you to concentrate because you want to go through one bit of the minefield rather than all of it, and also encourage you to disperse because they've got the depth defenses. If you all concentrate at the side, you're going to get hit. And then the advanced morale affects the rallying, and then the red fire. So why did we want these advanced rules? Essentially, it was to try and extend the lifespan of the game. After a few games, players seldom wanted to play again. It was a bit of a tic-tac-toe problem. Either you lost too many times and you were like, this game is unbeatable, which it is not, or you worked it out in your head, the Rubik's Cube, and you're like, cool, I now know how this problem is solved. I don't think I'm going to play this again. As a teaching tool, the base game provided limited options because it was essentially a frontal assault, which is the thing we don't want to be teaching people to do. It is the worst case, and so therefore, as a tactical tool, it was pretty limited. The line of sight restriction, as mentioned, wasn't there, and that's really important for all of our training and operations, so we added it. We couldn't really get a blinking red player, so we added that in as the option to do that, and therefore giving them the variable starting conditions, such as the red defenses, means that actually red player has options rather than just choosing which counter to fire at. The rally mechanic was clashing with the NCO junior officer experience of being able to task a section commander to move on an independent mission without having to be in line of sight of his commander. So we tweaked that a little bit, but that is then countered by the effect of fire being more debilitating based on the amount of fire that you get. But the most important thing from all that is that we felt the base system was solid enough to build upon without shattering the mechanics. So it would still work. It wouldn't be sort of a bad bodge on top of a good game, which is again a credit to Phil. In terms of the military reception, I'm only going to really show you the stuff that I've had back from people. So this is a fraction of the number of games we've given out. Top left, you've got soldiers from a unit of the British Army playing it, and they were then talked about that as tactics, and they went out and did some actual tactics in the field with all their kit on. You've got a cavalry unit using it because there isn't a cavalry version, although they probably would like there to be, and that's a reservist unit using it on a drill night. The bottom left is some generals who probably haven't done forward movement in a long time, looking at it with Andrew, another member of UK Fight Club, and that's in Paris, and that's less than 24 hours old. And the good old Devil Dogs, the US Marine Corps, who really are on the front foot with all this stuff and just shy away from any of the sort of connotations of nerdism, and they're actually having some beers as well as they're doing it, which just proves you can have a good time whilst doing some wargaming. And that, again, that's all junior leaders doing that. In the British Army, it has been given out more widely than it's been played, and I think the idea of sort of running it as a seminar session is where everyone's mindset is, rather than just letting people play and discover it themselves. And that's why we're still on the march to try and change people's mind. The thing I want to bring your attention to on the top right is that in Australia, DG TRADOC, so the Training and Doctrine Command, has put it on his professional wargaming list for 2022. So up there with the Battle for Moscow and Memoir 44 is Take That Hill. So well done, Phil and UK Fight Club for sort of beating a Days of Wonder game and an old Grognard game which is still going strong. The civilian reception, I would say, comes in two flavors. Either they know wargaming already and they're kind of attacking the mechanics, which is what most game tables sort of comments there are about, or they have no idea of wargaming and they have no idea of military tactics, in which case they're kind of learning both as they go, which is generally the best response. So we often caveat with this that if you've played a war game before, this probably isn't the game for you, because you're going to be too overqualified for the experience. But it's a good game to take and show someone else who isn't necessarily a wargamer. And these three young ladies who are here at DSET are all sort of working for a defense contractor, doing, I think, sort of missile technology sort of thing. So really bright people, but had never actually really been explained what war and soldiering is about. And they were doing a bit of that in there, and they sort of understood the dilemmas and trade-offs of moving or firing, and that there isn't really a right answer. This is a comparison from on the left, combat mission, so the digital game, a platoon attack scenario we built to allow for training, and then you've obviously got Take That Hill on the right. And both of these are mediums that you can use to train soldiers. And everyone will default to the one on the left, because I can zoom right in, I can see a soldier moving around in the woods, and it's fantastic levels of detail and granularity. However, which one is quicker to set up? Well, the one on the right. Which one requires prior training? The one on the left. I'm the only one pretty much in my unit who can do that, because I've done the pre-training in my own time. Which one's cheaper to make? Well, the one on the right's cheaper to make. The one on the left's already exists, but at 50 quid a pop or whatever, and then you need to get a laptop, power, and all the rest of it. You can transport the one on the right, difficult to transport the one on the left. More appealing to the layperson? Well, that kind of depends, but if you walk into a room and see the board game out, you're more likely to want to touch it. Whereas if you see someone playing a computer game, that can also generate an allergic reaction, or it can seem to be a one-person activity. Both are suitable as a teaching aid. It just depends how long you've got and the lessons you want to pull out. So the fine detail of lines of sight and enfilade fire, go for the left. The mechanics of an attack in quick time, go for the right. So a key decision required. And then this is leading on to a more complex game in the urban, which is where the Army's focus is, called Take That Street. And this is really where we're going to sort of kick it up about 5 gears. It's again using one of Phil's sort of precursor games, Blockbuster, but a number of other COTS mechanics and concepts to try and build it in. And essentially, we're trying to get away from stacking outside of buildings or just focusing on room clearances. This is about fighting between buildings, hence the street, the concept. Small level platoon, maybe a bit more, not massive urban sweeping city fights, but essentially command and control and fire and maneuver, concentration, dispersion, all that stuff in a couple of streets, in a couple of buildings, with various levels of destruction, etc. And that's where all this is leading to. So the idea is that, again, once you step through, Take That Hill, you're into another world. And again, Take That Street being one option. There are many others out there. And that kind of concludes my element. I've now got 2 slides for Ian and Mark, so I'll open it up to one of them.
Okay. Hi. I'd just like to kind of relate what we were doing with the extra research we were putting into sort of what should be a very familiar diagram in the Peter Perler's cycle of research. Phil's hard work with respect to the foundation of the war games is squarely in kind of the war game with the Area 1. The work that Ed's done, he's pushed it across over to the reality bridge into Area 3. Where myself and Ian were living is down in the data here, by almost inside out looking at the game using kind of techniques not typically associated with wargaming. In fact, sort of the designed experiments comes from the heavy industry use of chemical plants and physics. But what it does do, it allows you to reconstruct the model that Phil has put together and Ed has manipulated into reality. So we could come back and independently say, does this measure up the principal components for the technical? Have we got it right? And we do this by, let's say, a scientific method. Now, each one of those is a cycle in itself. I would say from Phil to Ed to myself and Ian, we've done an alpha, and already we've generated stimulating conversation between self, Phil, Ed. What happens next? And the cycle of research means that we continue round and round. What's the word I'm saying? not renewing, we're sort of progressing the model in the sort of to a final point.
If I could just jump in there, Mark, I think one thing that's key is that we started this in lockdown, first COVID lockdown, and as a result of doing this research using the designed experiments, we basically managed to meet Ed. It was an indirect means by through a mutual friend, Tom Mowat. And so from that, we came into Fight Club and were very thankfully also involved in the first games testings for Take That Hill in the new release. So Ed might not know it, but we were also using a design experiment to trial runs on how to do things and try and experiment to find out how best to use the game. And it's quite possible with if you take the analytical approach that way to just understand what are variables in a game and design an experiment to systematically test a game, if that's what you choose to do. Of course, that's not how people play it, but it's how a games designer can then take a game and see if it's going to work correctly as they would anticipate, which is what we found in our original paper does. So I'd recommend people have a read of the paper. We've left some links there. Happy to talk about that offline. Back to you, Mark.
Well, I think that's really a point where we can actually go back over to questions.
Yep, happy.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Right. Chris, I hope you're listening in. I don't see any questions at the moment. I know there are some because you said there were. Just while we're rectifying that, fine, okay, I can now see a question, so we can all answer that in a second. Just one point I forgot to mention at the end of my overlong presentation, which is if you are interested in any of my designs, combined arms specifically, but any of the other ones, very simple, just Google Sabin Wargames and you'll find my website, and there you'll find the links to download Combined Arms, Take That Hill, and so on and so on. Okay, so just for that. Right. The question there we can see from Tracy Johnson. Ammo wasted and so on. Yes. Okay. Let me just very quickly respond on this. One of the points of my fire and movement game, which I didn't carry into Take That Hill for simplicity, was precisely ammunition limits. You're absolutely right that most of the weapons that are fired don't hit the target. They don't kill somebody. They might have an effect, but they don't kill anybody. The other great limit, of course, is that there's a grave limit to how much lead the soldiers can carry. John Salt did a very interesting paper in the Nugget, the Wargames newsletter publication, which basically said that if everyone, even in World War II, let alone with automatic weapons, shot as fast as they could with bolt-action rifles and so on, and with their Bren guns, they'd fire off all their ammunition in 5 minutes. And yet, battles lasted 5 hours, often. So clearly, people are not shooting at this sort of rate all the time. In fire and movement, I actually have a mechanic, which is that every time you fire, you have a chance that your unit becomes ineffective, the unit that's firing, because it's literally run short of ammunition. So you are encouraged not to waste your fire unless it's actually serving a purpose, like having the somebody be able to move. But it's really interesting that it's not been sufficiently looked at, the extent to which once you've won fire superiority, you're not just firing continuously with your machine guns and everything, because you're having to limit your ammo expenditure. The key thing is you've won it, and therefore you're occasionally firing to keep the enemy's heads down, and they can't effectively fire back at you. But this ammo expenditure is a crucial issue, not reflected in Take That Hill, or in many war games, I have to say, but it really should be. Thoughts from the other team, members of the team?
Yeah, Phil, I second that. I suppose the way I would say we get around it is that the frontline scales for an infantry platoon would cover down doing that action, but at the end of it, they would then be requiring to be replenished. An instructor could quite simply instruct the student playing at a certain point that there is an ammo shortage and one section is unable to fire, etc., and create that problem for someone playing it. But again, for an intro war game, I think modeling it and recording it, that's where computers are really good and provide that fine detail. So if I did that in combat mission, I can tell you how many bullets and grenades every single soldier has. But that's not necessarily realistic because the AI is firing at a rate that my soldiers might not actually fire at in real life.
Yeah, I understand better now why the Germans in their doctrine laid such stress, and they're often on the defense, but they laid such stress on an immediate counterattack to retake a lost position. Why? Well, one reason is the people who've just taken it are not properly organized to defend it and are low on ammunition. So they're in the worst possible state to see off that counterattack, which can often reverse the result of the initial attack. But ammo is key in that. Mark and Ian, anything on that?
Just that sort of, yes, with the computing, you can take note of all manner of variables. One of the interesting things we did is that we measured kind of the action stack of possible actions you do. So the number of active fire you did to actually get the effect. So you would come back with a proportion of hits and actually a proportion of fire to movement, and how you actually sort of define that as even as a strategy. Do you concentrate on the movement? Do you concentrate on the fire, depending upon the effectiveness of the fire coming in back at you? So yes, it's kind of, is it an emergent theme, or do you go with a recipe of kind of a magic formula to 50% of your hits for your fires? Are you engaging at the right level? If that's based back to reality is the question that I would actually put the crossover as the results of a model to say, does this hold true?
And I would just copy there that bookkeeping is the bane of desktop wargaming. And so, that's how far do you want to go with that? And I mean, the other caveat on this is that in some of the games I'm developing, you put real casualties down on the battlefield as well. And of course, we're not really dealing with that in Take That Hill Again because it's a 101 game, but that's a separate issue. So there's plenty of other variables you could introduce to make it more real. But the point of Take That Hill is it's the 101 game that you learn to start with, I think.
Yeah. On the bookkeeping point, it's a very, very good point. One simple way of avoiding bookkeeping is again to use dice. So if you roll a 6, that's a good result. You've actually achieved a great effect. But the downside of it is you run low on ammo. Okay. So trying to reduce the impact of random variation by making the dice themselves something that can hurt you as well as help you. You see, another one which is in my fire and movement game, because if you run out of ammo on a roll of 6, you can have nobody run out of ammo, or you can have everybody run out of ammo on turn 3 or something. It's too random still. Is I have a simple tracker, so that every time you fire, you advance the thing round a circle by 6 or 8 spaces, and every time it passes go, the firing unit becomes ineffective. Yeah, because otherwise a purely random system avoids bookkeeping, but it's too random and it has an unrealistic effect. So it's a very, very interesting question. Actually, it raises all sorts of design issues. Do we have another question, Chris? Right, why don't you start with that, Ed, because Take That Street is your baby.
So using the game we've just talked about, no, urban warfare is incredibly, I don't want to say more complex, because I'm a believer of the sort of warfare has always been complex model. However, trying to model lines of sight, 3 dimensions, sort of fire team level, moving through a doorway while someone shoots through a window, all that sort of stuff means that the rules need to be so much more robust, so much more rigid and codified. Or you go the other end and you go free Kriegspiel, but unless you're an expert in urban warfare, you're going to struggle to try and model that. A lot of urban war games out there have tried to tackle this with varying degrees of success, and I think every single one has got flaws. We're going to have the same problem with Take That Street, and therefore it's going to model some stuff well, some stuff okay, and some stuff poorly or not at all. And the players need to know that going in, so they don't try and use the game as a training experience, which it's not going to model.
just to pick up on that, blockbusting, which is the precursor to this and is even simpler than the Farren movement, though not as simple as Take That Hill, is available in full in my Simulating War book that I showed you. So if you're interested in that, in how this type of system can be applied, that's one possibility. Looking at board games that have done this, let me just give you an instance from Squad Leader and Sniper, two old classic board games. Squad Leader by John Hill is a classic, but very much designed for effect, because each hex is supposed to be 50 meters, but the hexes are the width of a street. Now, in reality, you don't get 50-meter wide streets, but that's because he's trying to include within it warfare in the open country, as well as what's going in the cities, where clearly crossing a street is a fundamentally dangerous thing to do. And he does that by abstraction. He's open and honest about it, and most people think it works pretty well. But it illustrates the problem of scale when you try and use the same rules for country fighting and street fighting. The other one that springs to mind, there's plenty of commercial urban warfare games, including, of course, Urban Operations, I think it's called, by Sébastien Peyret, which was designed as much in France, which was designed as much for professional use as for hobby use. But Sniper springs to mind because it uses a hex grid, and in order that you don't have problems with buildings which are usually rectangular, all of the buildings are lozenge shaped. They're all diamond shaped, just so that they all have straight hex lines on every one of the corners. It shows you some of the problems you get into when you try to model urban warfare using traditional hex type system. Mark and Ian, anything on this?
Well, just to say again, I mean, Ed's principal designer for Take That Street, and so Mark and myself are actively involved in testing that. And I mean, I come to it like Mark does as a hobby wargamer for many years standing, 40 years plus. And it's been very eye-opening to work on that as a problem. We're not military trained, but by God, it doesn't have to make you think about it very quickly. And I would just say to anyone that's out there, come into the Fight Club pool, because the more people we get to test these games, the better the product will be. I think that's certainly the case with Take That Hill, that, we spent time testing it, and then what we got at the end was a really robust product. Same's going to be true for Take That Street. Mark?
It's a work in progress. I'm learning lots there, so I'm looking forward to the end product.
Right, Chris, do we have another question? Oh, right. What are some tips for designing a model? Mark and Ian, why don't you start off on this rather than waiting till the end?
Do you mean a designed experiment model? I'll take that's what you mean by the question. So if you're going to do that, what you need to think about are variables, things that you can change in the game. So in our design, we were looking at concentration versus dispersion, as Ed was talking about, whether you have a leader based at the back of the movement or at the front, and how many you move or how many you fire. So once you begin to think of a game in those terms, you can define the number of variables, and there are off-the-shelf designs that you can look up. I'm an ex-ICI UK chemical industry scientist, so I've been doing this for 32 years in industry. There's specialist software that you can do to do the analysis, but if you just basically look at having systems at high and low levels for any variable, you just plot it out and off you go. So designing a model is based around understanding fundamentally what the game is trying to do, and then looking at it systematically. So Mark had a really good insight into that, and it's buried into the paper. So over to you, Mark.
Sorry, you have to excuse me. I'm recovering from COVID at this present moment in time, so every now and again, I get short of breath. Excuse me. Yeah, I was actually thinking a little bit of the opposite. Is it so that sometimes opposites, you can design something for an effect, but there is the unexpected consequences of rules that are effective. It's so isn't just a case of winning a game, playing it well. It's exploring the whole space of opportunities that I have to find out if the stuff that is actually in there that shouldn't be in there. That's my bugbear, to actually think that, say, okay, you can design something like Take That Hill and it works well. Is there things that are silly in there that just because people don't use it in a because it's counterintuitive, that it will work, and those things need to be explored so you have a full width of what that game gives to you, so it doesn't inadvertently pass on to the next person who uses the game. They suddenly find out that there's a hidden wrinkle in there, and that's my take.
Okay.
Ed?
I'm going to try and bridge it to Phil, but I think sort of you guys have mentioned sort of the loopholes and cheat codes, which has been a sort of conversation we've been having in the background between various versions of the game, and inadvertently building in a way to have an unrealistic result. What I would say is that the best way is to play a lot of games, see a lot of mechanics, build a model, and then playtest, and adjust from there. Phil?
The question really revolves around what is meant by model. And there's quite a debate about this. For some people, a model is what Ian and Mark have done, modeling the behavior within the game. For others, Take That Hill itself could be a model. For purists, Take That Hill contains models, but is an overall simulation or simulation game. And a model is very specifically an algorithm, such as the combat results table for rifle fire in Charles Grant rules. That's a model. A game is made of much more than just a single model. Anyway, one or two thoughts about the broader interpretation of the term model. I think the most important principles are outlined by Dunnigan: keep it simple and plagiarize. This is really, really important. Take ideas from other people and do keep it simple. A simple game or a simple model that is played, I think, will teach more than a complex one which is not, and that's certainly our experience with all of the different games we've looked at. The other key point, I think, is that it doesn't matter. A model can succeed even by being wrong. And one of the key experts on modeling theory suggests it's almost better if it's wrong. Why? Because people will come along and tell you why they think it's wrong and how to make it right. That is making everybody, including the designer of the model, think. Yeah. So this is absolutely crucial. Wargaming design is an iterative process. You put something together and it usually doesn't work. But because it doesn't work, you can see it, or other people can see why it doesn't work, and then the next iteration will be better. And this is true of the wargame itself, the models within the wargame, or of models of the wargame like the ones that Mark and Ian have done. So this openness to criticism. There was a wonderful illustration of this. It was Ed Chamberlain's, I think, or Chamberlain's naval blockade game back in the 19th century. And he designed this, and it's not very realistic at all. It's just a derivative of a chess type game about blockading an enemy port. Anyway, his story was he took it to the mess, and the officers there were playing it, a game they can try and win. He sat back and looked at this, and he said there was more discussion of real naval tactics in the mess that day than he'd ever seen before, sparked by this admittedly abstract and unrealistic model, because people were actually talking about how you would really blockade a port. Yeah, and the same applies to any kind of war game, that people will criticize it, whether it's got rigid rules or whether it's got free rules. People will criticize it and say, oh, no, I think it should be like this. And someone else will say, no, I think it should be like this. They would never have articulated that had they not been prompted by the modeling attempt. So a bad model in that sense can be as useful as a good model, as long as people don't just ditch it and throw it out and ignore the whole process, but engage with it and try and make it better. Okay, any more questions? Right. we've answered all the questions. I am conscious, though, that particularly because of the glitch with Mark and Ian, we didn't have a lot of time, and they were commendably brief in their closing statements, particularly. So I would like to give Mark and Ian 5 minutes, 10 minutes, if you like, to amplify what you said, particularly perhaps to say a bit more about your article and so on. But anything else, because you were shortchanged, and I'd like you to have this opportunity for posterity.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's one of those things that I'm actually processing a lot of what actually both yourself and Ed have said. And the one thing that really comes through is that the play test element and the constructive way of arranging the play test to me is key. The games, and it's something that Ed said about Take That Hill, it looks nice, it looks pretty, but it isn't supposed to be left on the mantelpiece. It's got to be used and played. It's got to be taken out and shown, taken apart, put back together again. That's the whole principle of war games for me. You're right, there's no such perfect, hallowed artifact that isn't available for scrutiny. And it's through that inquisitiveness, I think, you actually push forward the art and science of wargaming. The diagram of the Peter Perler's cycle of research, we're just one chunk of it. The other side of it, the realism, the field exercises, and sort of the information that can come back in, which, okay, the likes of combat result tables and sort of to bring more realism into the game. To me, when there's more people like myself talking to Phil, talking to Ed in a circular fashion, I think Fight Club has actually got a very, very good formula, and long may it last. Ian?
Yeah, that's a really good sign off on there. In terms of using designed experiments, I mean, the question is really what you would like to try and tackle. Mark and I are the early stages of looking at a combined arms situation in the Western Desert, 1942, simply because we want to try and apply the methodology to a tactical situation where we'll be fluctuating things like composition of an infantry force, composition of an armored force, and also artillery support and anti-tank force, together with things like your tactics, whether you're going to be doing a flanking attack, whether you're going to be looking at low-level light because you're in a heat haze situation. Lots of different variables there. You can do 15 different variables in 16 runs, which is quite a small number of different war games to actually fight and extract quite a lot of information out on that. And we're going to hopefully get that together to publish again, maybe. One comment is that writing up what we did for Take That Hill as an academic paper is a task in its own right, but it doesn't have to systematize your thoughts and experience on the paper. It's good to do, but there's probably not out in open academic literature many journals that want to take publications on war games. It's probably a neglected area of academic study there. So we had to thrash around to find a journal to accept this paper, International Journal of Serious Games, which is in essence a journal that looks at computerization. So Mark kindly went out and computerized Take That Hill so that we could sneak in under the radar for the game. There we are, really. It's a question of what you want to apply it to, and there's no end of things you can apply it to.
Sorry. Okay, Ed, any final thoughts?
I suppose final thoughts are sort of, don't underestimate the value of an existing war game, which might be sort of 70% what you need, and then adding a few bits and bobs onto it and testing that isn't breaking the model. It can be really useful. I seem to have an inability to design an original game, but an ability to add and modularize onto existing games, because a lot of the hard work to get a working model has been done, and that should be encouraged, because you're not stealing someone's idea, you're advancing a mechanic, a model, a game system, and that's how we all understand that there's nothing new under the sun. So I encourage all potential game designers to start with that in mind, and you'll be surprised by what is out there that you can use.
And just to conclude on that, there's nothing to be ashamed of in tweaking a game that somebody else has originated. Flanagan himself, as I said, plagiarize is one of the key principles. I've designed games myself, I've published games myself. Most of my current designs are, in fact, adaptations of other people's games, rather than freestanding ones. I take the best of them. It's a bit like the Parson's Egg cartoon, where the bishop says, "I'm sorry, you've got a bad egg," and the curate says, "No, it's good in parts." That's my experience with almost all games that I play, that there's good elements in them, there's bad elements in them. What you do, you either throw the whole thing away and try and buy another game and then find that that's got problems as well of a different kind, or you start tweaking to improve the bad while keeping the good. And that's actually my main design focus at the moment. That's the easiest way to start in this whole thing. And as I said, that's what's great about games, because a bad game or an imperfect game, and they are all imperfect, is nevertheless something really useful as long as you engage with it and try and improve it. The other final point I would make is it's all very well just doing it solo and only for your own use and so on. But as I hope this panel has shown, the more people you can bring in from diverse backgrounds, civilian and military, academic, non-academic, and so on, the more different perspectives you'll get. And as long as you're careful and you don't just go for the lowest common denominator, the camel, the horse designed by a committee sort of approach, I think it's great to talk, and the benefit to everyone is enormous. I have learned so much from just preparing for this particular session, engaging properly with Mark and Ian's article, looking properly at Ed's changes and realizing, how important some of those tweaks are. So the interaction among people is a crucial benefit. Some people use war games not to teach tactical principles. They use war games on ancient warfare in a professional context. And the point is team building. The point is to get people together, talking, comfortable with one another. Yeah. So the utility of war games is enormous. Not just a war game that is, if you like, training people to do a particular task, but bringing people together, getting them to focus on an unfamiliar situation, challenging them as a team to engage with that, to work out what's going on, and to come up quickly with answers to it. For all these sorts of purposes, war games, like Take That Hill, it seems to me, are really useful. But as is in Flanagan's first principle, keep it simple. If you go down the slippery slope of complexity, or my experience at least is that really doesn't help. It turns most people off. They're not going to engage with it. They're not going to play the game, and you don't get the kind of benefits which are attainable by the simpler approach. Right. I hope you've enjoyed that. Lots of stuff otherwise online. I mentioned my website, Sabin Wargames. Professionalwargaming.co.uk is the other, Connections UK. There's a whole series of different websites and web resources out there. So go and discover them and join the debate yourself. And that leaves you 25 minutes before your next presentation. So go off and have a cup of coffee and prepare for the next words of wisdom. Thanks so much, and take care.